The day Serena Vale learned that a crown could be a collar in disguise, she was standing barefoot on cold stone, watching a woman she had never wronged walk through her front doors carrying another man's child, her husband's child, swollen and glowing and utterly unashamed. And the worst part? The worst part was that every wolf in Moonridge Pack watched Serena's face for the crack. They wanted to see her break. She didn't, not that day. But something quieter happened, something that doesn't make noise when it dies. If you've ever smiled through a wound that should have made you scream, you already know her story. Stay until the end, hit like, and drop your city below. Let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. The baby came in the dead of winter. Serena heard the screaming from 2 floors up, muffled through stone and timber and the thick silence that had settled over Moonridge Packhouse like snow over a battlefield. She was sitting in the chair by the window, the one she used to share with Damon before sharing things stopped being something they did. And she was not crying. She had stopped doing that weeks ago, sometime after the announcement, and before the permanent numbness set in behind her sternum. Below, in the room Damon had cleared and furnished with a speed he had never once applied to anything she had ever asked of him, a woman named Laura Voss was laboring to bring his child into the world. Serena pressed her palm flat against the frosted glass. Outside, the pack grounds were empty. The guards had been repositioned. Everyone who mattered had been redirected toward that room, toward that woman, toward that event. As if the rest of the pack house, the parts where Serena still slept and ate and moved through the hours like a ghost learning the shape of its haunting, had simply ceased to exist. She had been Luna of Moonridge for 6 years. She had stood at Damon Blackthorn's left side through 3 border disputes, 2 succession challenges, a sickness that killed 9 wolves in a single winter, and the kind of slow institutional rot that happens when an alpha starts believing his own myth so completely that no one dares hand him a mirror. She had smoothed alliances with her words when his temper fractured them. She had sat with grieving families in the early hours of the morning when Damon was already 3 counties away and too proud to turn back. She had been the continuous, quiet, load-bearing wall of this pack for 6 years. She pressed harder against the glass. The cold bit into her hand. Downstairs the screaming peaked, and then went strange, wrong, too high, and then too sudden. And then there was a different sound. The thin, furious wail of a newborn who had no idea what world it had been born into. Serena closed her eyes. She stayed in the chair until the house went quiet again. It took a long time. Bosm. The knock on her door came just before dawn. She already knew it was Damon before he opened it. 6 years of sharing walls with someone, even walls as thick as the ones they had built between them, and your body still learns the particular weight of their footfall, the specific rhythm of their breath outside a door. She did not stand. She did not turn from the window. He came in without waiting for an answer. He had always done that. "Laura is dead," he said. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Serena watched the ripples in her own chest and said nothing. She hemorrhaged. The midwife couldn't stop it. His voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when the person speaking them has not yet decided how they feel about what they are saying. The child survived. A boy. Serena turned then. She had to see his face. He was standing just inside the doorway, still dressed, his dark hair pushed back from his face, with one hand in that gesture she used to find beautiful and now found simply exhausting. He looked like a man who had just watched something break and was already calculating the cost of the damage. Not a man in grief. A man in logistics. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it, because she had never wished Laura Voss dead. She had wished her gone. She had wished her humiliation erased, her own marriage restored to something that resembled what she had believed it to be on the day she first said yes. But not dead, not a child left without a mother before it was 12 hours old. Damon looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "The boy needs care," he said. "There are women in the pack who have recently... He'll be raised here." His voice shifted to that register she had long since catalogued under the heading of non-negotiable. "In this house. As my heir." Serena felt the cold from the window at her back and the cold from his words settling over her from the front. "And what exactly are you saying to me, Damon? It was not a question. She knew the shape of what was coming the way you know a storm by the way the light changes 3 hours before it hits. I'm saying he'll need a mother. The silence that followed was not empty. It was so full of things neither of them were saying that it had actual weight. Serena felt it on her shoulders. You're asking me, she said slowly, to raise your son by another woman in this house, as if he were... I'm not asking. He met her eyes. You're Luna. This is what Luna means. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the jaw she used to cup in her hands in the dark. The mouth she used to believe told her the truth. The eyes that had stood across from hers at a binding ceremony and said words that were supposed to mean forever, and had apparently meant something else entirely, something with a much shorter shelf life and much more flexible definitions. Get out, she said. He left. He always left. That was the one thing he was consistent about. She went to see the baby at dawn. She told herself she went because she needed to see the thing she was being asked to absorb into her life, to look at it squarely so she could build an argument against it. She told herself it was tactical. She told herself a great many things in those years that required a certain aggressive self-deception to maintain. The midwife, a compact older woman named Bren, who had served the pack for 2 decades and kept her opinions tucked behind her teeth the way professionals learn to do, looked up when Serena entered. Something shifted in the older woman's face, not pity, which Serena could not have endured, but something closer to acknowledgement. The particular look of one woman recognizing another who is being asked to swallow something enormous and is choosing, for reasons of survival, to do it quietly. The baby was in a basket near the fire. Serena stood over him. He was very small. He had Damon's dark hair, already thick and slightly curling at the temples. His face was scrunched in the boneless way of new things, his hands fisted against his chest, his whole body radiating the kind of furious, unearned heat that only the newly alive possess. He opened his eyes. They were not Damon's eyes. They were not Lara Voss's eyes either, or at least not what Serena remembered of Lara Voss's eyes. Dark, calculating, certain of her own beauty, in a way that had always suggested a childhood during which that beauty had been her primary currency. This child's eyes were the pale gray-green of sea glass, and they looked at Serena with the complete and utter blankness of a creature that has not yet learned what the world is, and therefore fears none of it. Serena's chest did something involuntary and inconvenient. She did not pick him up, not that morning. She stood there for a long time and looked at him and thought about all the things she was not going to let this moment mean. And then she went back upstairs and sat with her back very straight in the cold chair by the window and watched the sun come fully up over the tree line and thought about what it costs to be a person who does the right thing in circumstances specifically designed to make the right thing feel like surrender. She did not reach a conclusion. She just sat there until the cost felt familiar enough to carry. They named him Elias. Damon announced it at the pack gathering 3 days later, standing at the high table with the easy authority of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether his decisions would be obeyed. The pack stood in rows below, and their faces showed the careful blankness of people who had long since learned that visible opinions were a liability in Moonridge. Serena stood at Damon's left. She was always at Damon's left. She wore the Luna's circlet and her good dress, and the expression she had spent 6 years perfecting, composed, present, unreadable. She had gotten very good at it. It was the most expensive skill she had ever developed, and it had cost her a privacy that she would never fully recover. Elias Blackthorne, Damon said, will be raised in this house and will one day lead this pack. The pack gave the appropriate sounds of assent and approval. Serena watched their faces move through the performance and said nothing and smiled when the moment required it and stood still when stillness was called for. Afterward, in the corridor behind the great hall, one of the elder wolves, Marta Hale, who had known Serena's mother and had eyes like a woman who had made a career out of watching things other people weren't watching, stepped into her path. "Luna," Marta said. She paused and looked at Serena in that way of hers, as if she were reading something written on the inside of your sternum. "How are you?" Again, not a question. An assessment. "Managing," Serena said. Marta looked at her a moment longer. The boy needs someone steady. I know. I'm not saying you should be that person, Marta said quietly. I'm saying that if you choose to be, choose it for yourself, not for him. She didn't need to clarify which him she meant. Duty without consent is just a prettier word for what it actually is. She moved past before Serena could respond. Serena stood in the corridor and felt the weight of that for a long time before she filed it away in the part of herself where she kept things that were too accurate to examine in the open. The first weeks with Elias were the worst, and then they were less bad, and then they were something else that she didn't have a clean word for. She had not intended to be the one who woke with him in the night. There were women assigned for that, pack members who had nursing children of their own and could provide what she couldn't, physical necessities she was not equipped to offer. But the pack house was large and old, and sound carried in strange ways through its stone corridors. And the first time she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of him crying, not the sharp cry of hunger or discomfort, but the lower, more bewildered sound of a creature that is woken in a dark room and does not understand why it is alone. She was on her feet before she had decided to be. She stood over his basket in the nursery and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the crying slowed and then stopped, and she thought, this is the oldest trick in the book. This is what helplessness does. It recruits you. It makes you feel like the choice was yours when really it was just biology running its program in the dark. She picked him up. She sat in the chair by the window in the nursery, which was a different window from her own window, but offered the same black sky and the same indifferent arrangement of stars, and she held him against her chest and felt his breathing slow into the rhythm of something that had decided it was safe, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about what she was doing and why, and whether there was a version of herself that could have put him back down and gone back to bed and let someone else absorb this particular weight. She couldn't find that version. She looked for her, and she wasn't there. So, Damon kept his distance from the child in a way that should have troubled her more than it did in those early months. He came to the nursery occasionally. She would hear him down the hall, would hear the door, would wait for some sound of engagement, and hear only silence and then footsteps leaving. As if he stood in the doorway and looked and then walked away repeatedly on a schedule that had no pattern she could decode. She asked him about it once, in the kitchen, in the early morning before the house staff arrived. She had started developing a habit of early mornings in the kitchen, the only room in the house that felt like it belonged to no one in particular, that carried no specific weight of history or humiliation. You haven't held him, she said. Damon was standing at the counter with his back to her. I'm aware of that. He's your son. I know what he is. She watched the set of his shoulders, the specific tension in them that meant he knew he was saying the wrong thing and had decided to say it anyway, which was its own particular kind of cowardice that she had long since stopped finding surprising. He's going to notice, she said. Not now, but soon. Damon turned. His face did the thing it did when he was being cornered into something he didn't want to feel. The jaw tightening, the eyes going slightly distant, like he was stepping back behind glass. Are you telling me how to be a father? I'm telling you how children work, she said, which you would know if you'd ever let yourself be uncomfortable enough to find out. He looked at her for a moment, then, you sound like you're enjoying this. The sheer wrongness of that, the particular flavor of accusation it carried, the implication that her engagement with his child was somehow revenge or theater, hit her somewhere underneath her ribs, and she felt for one bright, ugly moment the thing she spent most of her energy containing, the anger, the real thing, not the controlled variety she permitted herself in private, the version with teeth. Get out of the kitchen, she said very quietly. He left. She stood at the counter and breathed until the anger was manageable again, and then she went back to the nursery where Elias was beginning to wake, making the small preliminary sounds of a child deciding whether today was a crying day or an interested day. And she picked him up before he could work himself up to the former, and she said quietly into the top of his head, which smelled like milk and warmth and the specific clean animal scent of young things. Good morning. He grabbed her finger. She did not think about what that meant. She had gotten very good at not thinking about what things meant. Spring came and Elias began to focus his eyes, and find faces interesting and respond to her voice with the whole body enthusiasm of a creature for whom joy was still entirely uncomplicated. Serena developed, with some privacy and no small amount of self-examination, a sense of humor about the situation that was dark enough to be honest. She was raising the evidence of her husband's betrayal, and she was good at it. She was better at it than he was. This was both absurd, and in some specific way she was still working out hers. The pack watched her. They had always watched her. The Luna was always watched. It was the nature of the position. You were both symbol and surveillance subject simultaneously. But now they watched her with a particular intensity that she recognized as the community processing something it didn't have an established script for. Some of them came to her with what was clearly rehearsed kindness, the careful warmth of people who knew they were witnessing something that should not be happening and had decided to compensate with gentleness. She thanked them. She did not require their understanding. Others were less careful. There was a woman named Cass Del Rey, mid-30s, sharp-faced, the kind of person who had spent her whole life in the middle of every significant social transaction in the pack, and had therefore developed the confidence of someone who had never been truly isolated, who caught Serena in the courtyard one afternoon in early spring. "It's generous," Cass said, falling into step beside her in a way that made escape awkward. "What you're doing? Most women wouldn't." "Most women," Serena said, "aren't asked to." "Still," Cass looked at the child in Serena's arms. "He's beautiful. Looks like the alpha." "He's a baby," Serena said. "He looks like a baby." Cass smiled the smile of someone who knew she was being deflected and found it informative. "You must be," she paused, choosing something, "very strong to manage all of this." Serena stopped walking. She looked at Cass directly, which was something she had found over the years made most people immediately uncomfortable. "What are you actually trying to say to me?" Cass blinked. "I was just saying, you were measuring the distance between generosity and stupidity and seeing which side of the line I landed on." She kept her voice level, pleasant even. "I've noticed that people who call women strong usually mean they find it impressive that we endure things we shouldn't be expected to endure in the first place. I don't need that particular kind of admiration. But thank you." She walked away. Elias made a sound against her shoulder that she chose to interpret as approval. The summer Elias turned 1, she caught Damon looking at her across the great hall during a packed dinner, a long, strange look that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not desire, or not exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something that might have been, in a man capable of the requisite self-awareness, the beginning of recognition. She looked back at him steadily until he looked away. Later, alone in the corridor outside the hall, she leaned against the stone wall and closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel the thing she usually kept moving too fast to catch. The grief of it. Not the anger, which was clean and directional and useful. The grief. The specific, shapeless weight of having loved someone who had turned out to be a different person than the one she'd believed she was loving. The waste of it. The years of real effort and real faith directed at a man who had apparently never considered what it might cost her to give them. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until she saw the specific dark red of blood through skin. Then she straightened, smoothed her dress, walked back into the hall. This was the other thing she had learned. The thing no one ever told you about surviving betrayal inside a life you can't immediately leave. You did not get to finish grieving before the next thing required your attention. Grief was not a project with a completion date. It was a condition you learned to move through without stopping, the way you learned to move through any terrain that wanted to slow you down. You kept walking. You carried what you were carrying. You did not put the child down. Marta came to her in the autumn. She came alone, in the late evening, with the look of someone who had been sitting with something for long enough that she had decided sitting with it any longer was a failure of nerve. Serena recognized the look because she had worn it herself, twice. On occasion she still thought about. "Close the door," Serena said. Marta did. She sat down without being invited, which Serena respected. "There are questions," the elder woman said, "that some of us have been asking privately about Lara Voss." Serena kept her face still. What kind of questions? The kind you ask when something doesn't sit right. Marta's eyes were steady, watchful in that particular way of hers. She was healthy. The birth wasn't complicated until it was suddenly catastrophic. The midwife who attended her, not Bren, the woman was brought in from outside the pack, left the territory within a week and hasn't been located since. Serena looked at the fire. I'm not saying anything definitive, Marta continued. I'm saying that Laura Voss was not a passive woman. She was not, despite appearances, a woman without strategy. There were people in this pack who had reason to find her inconvenient, and some of those people are not the ones you'd immediately think of. She paused. Some of them are close to the alpha. Why are you telling me this? Serena said. Because you are one of the few people in this house who is not primarily concerned with their own positioning, Marta said, and because the child deserves someone watching for him who has a clear view. After she left, Serena sat alone for a long time with the fire burning down to coals and Elias sleeping in the next room and the seed of something she wasn't ready to name, yet taking root in the part of her that had spent 2 years deciding whether the life she was living was something she had chosen or something that had simply closed around her while she was looking the other way. The night she overheard them, Elias was almost 3. She hadn't been trying to hear anything. She was coming back from his room. He had woken again from one of the bad dreams that had started recently, the ones where he woke already crying as if something had followed him up from sleep. And she was moving quietly through the corridor because the house was late dark and still, and she had learned in these years to move through dark spaces without making sound. The door to Damon's study was not quite closed. She knew his voice. She knew the voice of the man he was talking to, Renner, his closest advisor, the one with the flat affect and the reputation for solutions that solved too neatly. She stopped because the first sentence she caught was her name. Serena won't be a problem once the boy is old enough to— She's still Luna, Renner said. He said it like a complication. Not for much longer. Damon's voice was calm, the particular calm of a man who has already decided something and is now only working out the logistics. Voss of the Stonehaven pack has a daughter, young, strong bloodline, politically valuable. A binding there would consolidate the northern territories before the cold season. The council would require— The council will be managed— A pause. Elias will be 4 next spring, old enough to begin proper training, old enough for Serena's specific function in this house to become— Another pause, the particular length of a man choosing a word that will communicate brutality without committing to the sound of it. Redundant. And the Luna title? Stripped, Damon said, quietly, after the new binding. After the— Serena stood in the corridor and felt the stone under her feet and the cold air on her arms, and Elias's weight still faintly present in her body from where she had held him 20 minutes ago, and she thought with complete clarity about the word he had used. Redundant. That was what 6 years of carrying a pack looked like from the inside of his study at midnight. Redundant. She stood there for another moment. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She simply stood very still in the dark corridor and let the thing that had been building for 2 years, the thing she had been managing and containing and moving around like a load-bearing wall she was afraid to touch, finally go quiet in a way that was not peace and was not resignation and was not anything she had a word for yet. It was something simpler. It was the moment after you've been holding your breath for so long that you finally stop trying to hold it and just breathe. And what comes out is not air, but decision. She walked back to her room. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the window and she thought for a very long time, and when the sun came up she was still sitting there, and the thing she was thinking had taken on the clean, specific weight of a plan. She was not going to wait for the word redundant to become her official designation. She was not going to stand in the great hall one more time and smile while a man announced the next revision to her life. She was not going to let Elias grow up watching her swallowed. The child sleeping in the next room had spent 3 years learning what it looked like when someone stayed. She had given him that. It was the most real thing she had done in this house, and it belonged to neither of them. It belonged to what she was going to do next. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and looked at the window, and outside the glass, the world was ordinary and cold and indifferent, and somewhere in the pack house behind her, the man she had married was sleeping without knowing that she had just stopped being the woman he could afford to leave out of his calculations. The Luna crown sat on its stand by the mirror. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked away and began to think about the sea. 3 weeks later, Serena received a letter she had not been expecting, delivered not through the pack's internal channels, but by a runner she didn't recognize. A young woman who handed it over without meeting her eyes and left before Serena could ask a question. The seal on it was one she knew, the Voss family crest, Stonehaven Pack. The same family Damon had mentioned in that midnight conversation she was never supposed to have heard. She opened it slowly. The letter was not from the girl Damon intended to marry. It was from the girl's older brother, a man named Kyle Voss, who, the letter made clear in spare and careful language, had no interest in watching his sister used as a political consolidation tool for a pack that had, in his personal assessment, begun to rot from the top down. He was reaching out, he wrote, to the Luna, specifically to the Luna, not to the Alpha, because it had come to his attention that certain documents and correspondence belonging to his late cousin Lara might be of significant interest to the Elder Council of Moonridge. Documents that Lara had, apparently, been careful enough to keep outside Moonridge territory. He was not making demands. He was making an offer. He would be in the coastal territories in 1 month's time. If she wished to meet, she knew where to find him. Serena read the letter 3 times. Then she held it over the candle and watched it burn and scattered the ash in the cold hearth. She walked to the nursery. Elias was awake, sitting in the middle of his floor with a wooden horse she had carved him. Badly, honestly, but he had never once cared about that, making small deliberate sounds of narration for a battle only he could see. He looked up when she came in. "Rana?" he said. He had never managed to say her full name and had settled, sometime in his 2nd year, for this shortened version that she had never corrected because she found, secretly, that she didn't want to. "Hey, baby," she said. "Horse is fighting," he explained seriously. "Is the horse winning?" He considered this with the focused expression of a child who takes the internal logic of his own games very seriously. "Not yet," he said, "but he will." Serena crouched down to the floor beside him and looked at the wooden horse and thought about the letter that was now ash and the coast that was a month's journey south and the thing that was no longer just a plan but a departure. "Yeah," she said quietly. "He will." She rested her chin on her knees and watched her son arrange his battle, and outside the window the first real snow of the season had begun to fall across Moonridge, soft and silent and covering everything. And tomorrow morning Damon would receive word from Stonehaven Pack formally requesting a binding negotiation meeting, a message that had been arranged without his knowledge, and that contained, buried in its courteous diplomatic language, an instruction that would redirect his full attention toward the Northern Territories for the next 3 weeks. 3 weeks. That was all she needed. Somewhere in this house right now, in a study she had walked past 1,000 times, there was a man who had spoken the word redundant and gone to sleep untroubled by it. He was going to wake up one morning very soon and find the Luna crown on its stand and the divorce papers on his desk and the Luna herself gone, and with her the child he had called his heir without ever once asking what the child might have to say about it. Serena put her hand on the top of Elias's head. He leaned into it without looking up, the easy, unconscious trust of a child who has learned that this particular hand means safe. She kept it there, and looked at the snow and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not yet peace, but was the thing that comes just before it, the specific cold clarity of a woman who has finally decided that the life she was handed and the life she is going to live are 2 entirely different places. And one of them, for the first time, was her choice. The snow was still falling when Serena began to disappear herself. Not all at once. That was the first lesson of leaving a place that had teeth. You did not run. Running announced itself. Running left tracks in the snow and panic in the air and gave the thing chasing you a direction. You dissolved. You became quieter than you already were, which in Serena's case required a specific discipline because she had already spent 3 years becoming very quiet indeed. She started with the money. The Luna's household accounts ran through her directly. This had been Damon's arrangement, not out of trust but out of convenience, because managing the domestic accounts of Moonridge Packhouse was the kind of administrative work that held no appeal for a man who considered his time better spent on power consolidation. She had been moving small amounts for 11 days now, not enough to register as a pattern, enough to build something functional on the other end. The morning after the letter burned in the hearth, she sat down with the accounts and looked at them with different eyes. Not Luna eyes, not the eyes of a woman auditing household expenditure. The eyes of a woman doing the math on what it cost to start over from nothing in a place where no one knew her name. The number was achievable. Barely. But barely was enough. She was in the storeroom taking inventory, a thing she did every 2 weeks, unremarkably, always had, when Damon found her. She heard his footsteps before she heard his voice. She always did. "I need you at the table tonight," he said from the doorway. "Stonehaven sent an advance representative. It's preliminary, but appearances matter." She did not look up from the ledger. "What time?" "7th hour, formal." A pause. "Wear the gray." The gray. The dress he liked because it read as authority without challenging his. She had known, when she bought it, exactly why he approved of it. She had bought it anyway because it was also genuinely a beautiful dress. And she had decided early in her marriage that she would not let his preferences ruin things that were good independent of him. "Fine," she said. He lingered. She could feel it, the particular presence of a man who had come to deliver a directive and found himself, against his intentions, still standing in the room. "Elias was asking for you this morning," he said. His voice had shifted register, slightly. Not much, but she had spent 6 years cataloging the gradations of his voice the way you catalog weather when the weather controls whether you eat. "I was with him at breakfast," she said. "I know." Another pause. "He didn't ask for me." She looked up then. She looked at him directly and kept her face exactly where she had placed it, neutral, attentive, the face she wore in rooms where she was being watched. "Children ask for who they've learned to expect," she said. The air between them held that for a moment. "Is that an accusation?" he said. "It's a fact. Whether it's an accusation depends on what you do with it." He looked at her for a long time with the expression of a man standing at a door he didn't open often enough. Then he left. His footsteps retreated down the corridor, and she listened until she couldn't hear them anymore, and then she wrote a number in the ledger that was different from the number she had written in the official one, and the difference went where it was supposed to go. Mummed. The Stonehaven representative was a young man named Pell, carefully dressed, with the practiced neutrality of someone trained from birth, in the performance of diplomatic indifference. He sat across the table from Damon with a pleasant expression that Serena recognized as the particular blankness of a man who had been given specific instructions and was following them with precision. She sat at Damon's left and poured nothing and said little and watched Pell the way she watched everything at these tables, with the part of her attention that never fully engaged, never fully withdrew, that had learned to read the subtext of rooms the way some people read weather. Pell was not who he appeared to be. This was clear within the first 10 minutes. He was too careful. Too much effort went into his ordinariness. The man who had come to make a preliminary assessment of a binding negotiation did not arrive with this quality of watchfulness unless he was watching for something specific. He looked at her twice, both times brief, both times deliberate. "The Stonehaven Alpha extends his personal regards to the Luna," Pell said at one point, with the particular inflection of a man embedding a secondary meaning in a courtesy. "The Luna thanks him," Serena said, with the particular inflection of a woman who received it. Damon heard neither exchange. He was speaking to Renner about territory boundaries. His attention was where it always was, on the architecture of his own influence. After the meal, in the corridor, Pell passed her on his way to the guest quarters. He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand without slowing his pace, without changing his expression, without looking at her at all. She did not read it until she was alone. 1 month. Coastal Road, 3rd waypoint south of the border marker. Ask for the house with the blue door. She burned this one too. She told Elias they were going on a trip 2 weeks before she intended to leave. Not what kind of trip, not how far. She had learned with him to introduce large changes in small pieces. to let him process the shape of a thing before he had to process the weight of it. "A trip where?" he said. He was sitting on the kitchen floor, which he preferred to chairs, eating an apple in the serious, methodical way he ate everything. "To see the sea." He looked up. He had not in his nearly 3 years of life seen the sea. He had heard about it. She had been telling him about it since before he could understand the words. Because she had grown up near water, and the memory of it lived in her body the way important things do, as a kind of home you carry in your chest. "Is it big?" he said. "Bigger than anything you've ever seen." He thought about this with the gravity of a child for whom scale was a concept still under active construction. "Bigger than the forest." "So much bigger." He took another bite of his apple. "Can I take the horse?" "You can take the horse." He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his apple, and Serena looked at the top of his dark head and felt the particular quality of love that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with accumulated mornings, accumulated small conversations, accumulated trust built one repeated presence at a time. She was going to give him the sea. She was going to give him a life that did not require him to learn, before he was old enough to defend himself, what it felt like to be peripheral in your own home. This was not sentiment. It was the most strategic thing she had ever done. Bren came to her on the 14th day. The older midwife knocked at Serena's door in the evening and came in and sat down without preamble, which meant she had something she had decided to say and was not going to work up to it gradually. "You're leaving," Bren said. Serena looked at her. "Why would you think that?" "Because I've watched you every day for 3 years, and I know the difference between a woman who has accepted her situation and a woman who has stopped fighting it because she's found a different door." Bren's eyes were flat and direct, and not unkind. "You've been calmer for the past 2 weeks than I've seen you in a year. That's not peace. That's someone who's already gone and is just waiting for their body to catch up." Serena held the older woman's gaze. "I'm not going to stop you," Bren said. "I'm not going to say anything to anyone. I want to be clear about that before you decide whether to insult me by denying it." "Then what do you want?" Bren reached into the pocket of her coat and produced a small sealed jar and a folded cloth that Serena recognized as a wound kit, clean bandaging, a few specific medicines. "The coastal road in autumn gets cold before you expect it to. Take the northern switchback past the second ridge, not the valley route. There are dogs in the valley that belong to Renner's brother, and they'll report movement." Serena stared at her. "Also," Bren said, setting both items on the table, "the boy gets a low fever when he's overtired. Willow bark and warm water before sleep. He won't fight you on it if you mix a small amount of honey." She stood up. "Bren," Serena said. The older woman looked at her. "Why?" Bren was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that was not simple and was not easily named. "Because I was here the night that baby was born," she said quietly, "and I was not the midwife who attended the labor. And I have spent 3 years thinking about what I should have done with what I know." She paused. "Some things cannot be fixed, but they can be accounted for." She left. Serena sat with the jar and the wound kit on the table in front of her, and the fire burning down to coals, and thought about the particular texture of a world in which the women who knew the most said the least in public, and what it cost them, and what they did with the dead of their own silence. She put both items in the bag she had been packing slowly, one quiet item at a time, for 11 days. She left on a Tuesday. She chose Tuesday because nothing happened on Tuesdays in Moonridge Packhouse. Damon traveled to the eastern border on Tuesday afternoons. A standing arrangement, a territorial check, something he had done on a consistent schedule for 2 years. Renner accompanied him. The house reduced. The guards rotated to the outer perimeter for their weekly drill. She had timed it to the minute. She had walked the route out of the house in her mind so many times that by the morning of the Tuesday she chose, the path was grooved into her like a physical thing. She woke Elias before dawn. He was already half awake, which sometimes happened. He had a sensitivity to shifts in the house, in her, that she had never entirely explained to herself. He looked at her in the dark room, and she looked at him, and he said, with the certainty of a child who had been accumulating information about the world and had drawn a conclusion, "Is it the trip?" "It's the trip," she said. He sat up. Do I need to be quiet?" She looked at him. 3 years old, dark hair crushed on one side from sleep, holding the wooden horse in both hands with the grip of someone who knew what mattered to bring when you weren't sure where you were going. "Yes," she said, "until we're past the ridge. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. He could, and he did. They were 3 hours out before the cold truly settled in. The northern switchback was harder than the valley road, but Bren had been right. She heard the dogs in the distance below them, heard them working a scent in the direction she had not taken, and felt the particular cold satisfaction of a decision vindicated. Elias rode on her back for the steep sections, his arms around her neck and the horse tucked under one arm, his weight a familiar pressure she had been carrying in some form for 3 years. He did not complain. He looked at everything, the frost on the rock faces, the gray light coming up through the trees, the particular quality of dawn that was different out here than it was through windows. He was making a catalog of it. She could feel the focused quality of his attention, even without seeing his face. When they reached the ridge and the path flattened and the pack territory fell away behind them, she stopped. She turned and looked back. She had expected something, some pull. The bond still existed. It would exist until the divorce was formalized and processed by the council. It was not a thing you could simply decide yourself out of, and she had expected it to assert itself here, at the threshold, with the particular weight of 6 years of legal and psychological tethering. What she felt instead was the cold on her face, the wind coming off the ridge, Elias's breath warm against the back of her neck. She turned around and walked forward. Behind her, on the desk in Damon's study, the divorce papers were weighted down by the Luna crown. She had not left a note. There was nothing she wanted to say that those two objects did not already say more cleanly than words. Chat. She did not know exactly when Damon came home that evening and found them. She was already past the second waypoint by then, moving through the last of the light with Elias asleep against her shoulder, his weight boneless and trusting, his breathing the slow, regular rhythm of a child who has decided that wherever this is going, it is safe enough to stop watching. She did not know which moment it was, whether it was the papers first or the crown first, whether Renner was with him or he was alone, whether he made a sound or went very still in the particular way he went still when something had finally exceeded his management capacity. She did not know, and she would not know for some time, and the not knowing was lighter than she had anticipated. She had expected the weight of it, the awareness of his reaction, the pull of it, even in anger. She had been conditioned by years of managing his responses to anticipate them even at a distance. What she felt instead was the road under her feet, the dark coming down around her, the coastal wind still 2 weeks away but already present in her mind as a destination, a smell, a sound that was bigger than anything she had ever heard, and that she was taking her son to see because she had promised him, and because some promises were the only true things left. She shifted Elias's weight against her shoulder. He stirred. "Rena." "Right here," she said. He settled back into sleep. She kept walking. And somewhere behind her, in a study in a pack house she had just finished being Luna of, the Alpha of Moonridge was holding a crown that his wife had placed on her own desk for 6 years, and the weight of what she had left him with was only beginning to make itself felt. That particular, irreversible weight of a man who has said the word redundant about the wrong woman, and is about to spend the next several months discovering exactly how wrong he was. The road curved south. Serena followed it. The blue door was exactly where Cale Voss had said it would be. A fishing settlement at the edge of the coastal territory, small enough that strangers were noticed, but transient enough that noticed did not automatically mean remembered. The house sat at the end of a salt-bleached lane with the sea audible behind it. That constant low conversation of water against rock that Serena had been hearing in her memory for years and was only now hearing with her actual body. And the difference between remembered sound and real sound was larger than she had prepared for. Elias heard it before he saw it. He went very still on her back, the way he went still when something was bigger than his existing categories for things, and she felt the change in his breathing. Slower, wider, like he was trying to take in more air than usual to accommodate whatever was happening in his chest. "That's it," she said. He didn't say anything. He just held on. She knocked on the blue door. Jam. Cale Voss was not what she had constructed from his letter. The letter had been precise and economical and careful. The letter of a man who chose his words the way you chose footing on unstable ground, deliberately, testing weight before committing. She had built from it an image of someone contained, formal. The diplomatic register of his family expressed in person the way it had been expressed on paper. The man who opened the door was tall, wind-roughened, with the kind of face that had clearly started out conventionally handsome and then spent 20 years being shaped by weather and decision into something harder and more specific. He looked at her the way people looked at you when they had been expecting you for long enough that the expectation had curdled slightly into something between relief and wariness. He looked at Elias. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly. Not surprise. He had known about the child. Something more complicated than surprise. The expression of a man who had been dealing in abstractions and had just been handed the concrete version. "Luna Vale," he said. "Not anymore," she said. He stepped back from the door. The house was small and clean and smelled of salt and wood smoke and the specific austerity of a space occupied by someone who had learned not to accumulate. Cale poured water and set bread on the table without comment, and Elias, who had decided within 30 seconds of entering that this man was not a threat, sat down and began eating with the focused efficiency of a child who had walked a very long way. "You made better time than I expected," Cale said. "I took the northern switchback." He nodded. "Renner's dogs. Someone told me about them." "Bren," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "You know her." "I know she was there the night my cousin died." He sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the table. "I know she's been carrying something she couldn't put down and couldn't hand to anyone in Moonridge without it being buried." He paused. "That's why I reached out to you directly. The Luna is the only person in that house whose interest in the truth doesn't depend on which version of it keeps them safe. I'm not the Luna anymore. You were when it mattered." He met her eyes. "The documents are here." Laura kept correspondence, specific correspondence, with 3 members of Damon's inner circle going back 4 years before her death. She was feeding them information about Stonehaven Pact's internal politics in exchange for positioning, for the promise of the Alpha's formal recognition. He paused again. The particular pause of a man who is about to say something that costs him. She was manipulating him, deliberately. The pregnancy may not have been unplanned in the way he believed it was. The fire crackled. Elias looked up at the word pregnancy with the frank curiosity of a child who was building his vocabulary aggressively, decided it wasn't directed at him, and looked back down. "And her death," Serena said. Cale's jaw tightened. "The correspondence stops 3 weeks before she died. There's a gap, and then there's a single letter from Renner to one of my cousin's contacts saying that the matter had been resolved." The words sat between them. Serena felt it land in the part of her that was not surprised and could not afford to examine why she was not surprised. "He killed her," she said. "I believe Renner killed her," Cale said carefully. "I believe Damon either ordered it or permitted it and has been managing the political cost of that decision ever since. I believe the reason he moved so quickly to install you as the child's caretaker was that a child without a mother is leverage, and a Luna raising that child is a narrative that protects him from questions he doesn't want asked. She had known some of this. She had known the shape of it, the way you know the shape of a thing in a dark room without being able to name its edges. Hearing it said out loud in a clean, plain room by someone with documents to support it was a different experience from knowing it in her bones. She looked at her hands on the table. "The council," she said. "If they had this, they would have to act," Cale said. 3 elders have already been asking questions privately. Marta Hale sent a message to my father 6 weeks ago. They're waiting for something they can hold." Serena looked up. "Why are you doing this? Your family gains nothing from destabilizing Moonridge." He held her gaze. "My family gains the removal of a man who had my cousin killed and has been using the threat of a binding negotiation with my sister as a distraction tactic for 2 months. Something moved behind his eyes. Not cold, but set. The expression of a man whose patience for a particular situation had a fixed and now exceeded limit. And I am doing this because Laura, whatever she was and whatever she did not deserve to die in a packhouse birth room with a midwife who wasn't there by accident. The fire. The sea outside the window, low and constant. Elias had fallen asleep at the table with his cheek on his arm and the wooden horse still in his hand. "Show me the documents," Serena said. But she spent 3 days in the Blue Door house reading. Laura Voss had been, in her way, a thorough woman. The correspondence was organized, not chronologically, but categorically, which told Serena something about the kind of mind Laura had possessed, the kind that sorted by type of leverage rather than by timeline. There were letters from Renner. There were letters from 2 other names she recognized as Damon's inner circle. There was a single letter in Damon's own handwriting. Not explicit, nothing that named the thing it was arranging, but specific enough in its language about problem resolution and pack security that read against the others it was its own kind of confession. She read it twice. She thought about the man who had written it. She thought about the kitchen in the early morning and the study at midnight, and 6 years of choosing to believe that whatever he was not the kind of man who would arrange for the mother of his child to be killed for inconvenience. She had been wrong. Or she had known and had needed to not know, which was its own kind of wrong, the kind that was harder to assign blame for because it was also the kind that kept you functional. You believed what you needed to believe to keep moving. This was not weakness. This was survival running its oldest program. She folded the letter and put it with the others and did not let herself sit with what it felt like for more than a few minutes, because there was not time, and because what it felt like was very large, and the work of feeling it would have to wait. Renner found them on the 4th day. She should have had more time. She had calculated more time. The northern switchback, the misdirection of the Stonehaven diplomatic channel, Damon's eastern border commitments. She had built a window of 3 weeks, and she had been inside day 4 when she heard the horses on the coastal road and looked through the salt-bleached window and felt her stomach drop with the specific cold certainty of a plan failing in real time. 4 riders. Moonridge colors. Renner at the front. Not Damon. Renner. This was the first data point she processed. The second was that Renner had not come with the numbers you sent for a conversation. He had come with the numbers you sent to contain a situation. Cale was beside her at the window. His face went very still. "There's a back way," he said quietly. "He'll have it covered." She had spent enough years watching Renner operate to know his methodology. He was a man who located exits before he entered any room. He knew we were here before he left Moonridge. How? She thought about the 14 days of preparation, the accounts, the specific route she had chosen on the advice of a woman who had been carrying guilt for 3 years. She thought about the particular precision of Renner's arrival, not a few days after they'd settled in, not a week. 4 days. Enough time for her to find the documents and not enough time to move them. Someone had told him. Not where they were going. She hadn't known exactly where they were going until she received Cale's second message. But enough. Enough about the documents. Enough about the meeting. "How many people knew about this?" she said to Cale. His jaw was set. 3. Myself, my courier, and... He stopped. The stop told her everything. "Your contact in Moonridge," she said. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the expression of a man discovering that a person he trusted had a price point he hadn't anticipated. It was the expression of someone who had believed himself to be more careful than he turned out to be, and was paying for that belief in the specific currency of immediate consequence. "He wouldn't," Cale started. "He did," she said. Outside, Renner dismounted. He looked at the house with the unhurried confidence of a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply performing the final steps. Well, she put Elias in the back room. She did it quickly, practically, without drama, because drama was not useful, and because the child was already reading the room with the acuity of a 3-year-old who had never been sheltered from the texture of reality. "Stay here," she said. "Don't come out until I come for you." He looked at her with those sea-glass eyes. "Are the bad men here?" She looked at him. "I need you to stay," she said. He sat down with the horse and did not argue. He had, already, at 3 years old, the quality of someone who understood that the most useful thing you could be in a crisis was the thing that didn't add to it. She did not know whether to be grateful for this or devastated by what it said about what he had been quietly absorbing in the walls of Moonridge Packhouse. She closed the door and went to meet Renner. He came in without knocking. He looked at Cale first, and then at her, and then around the room in the specific way of a man cataloging what was present and what was absent. Luna Vale, he said. The same title Cale had used, the same quality of it being past tense. Renner, she said. He looked at the table. The documents were not on it. She had moved them 20 minutes ago to a place she was reasonably confident he would not search without more time than he currently had. This was all the advantage she possessed, and she knew it was probably not enough. The Alpha requires your return, Renner said. He said it the way he said everything, with the flat procedural affect of a man who had long since separated the content of his words from any personal relationship to them. Both of you. The child is his heir, and his removal from the pack territory was unauthorized. The child's mother left of her own will, she said, with documentation that was properly filed. You're not the child's mother. The room held that. She looked at him. She looked at the face of the man who she now believed had stood in a birth room and made a decision about a woman who was inconvenient, and felt the anger move through her not as heat, but as something colder and more specific. The particular temperature of knowing who you are dealing with and what they are capable of, and having to calculate your next move in full awareness of both. What does he want? She said. The child returned. The documents returned, if documents exist. A pause. And the Luna's formal recantation of the filing. The recantation. The divorce filing will be withdrawn. You will return to Moonridge as Luna. The situation will be managed internally. He looked at her with the expression of a man delivering an offer he personally finds generous and expects to be accepted. Cale made a sound. Managed, Serena said. The way Laura's situation was managed. Something shifted in Renner's face. Almost nothing. Barely a degree of change, the kind you would miss if you had not spent years learning to read the specific language of a face that was professionally controlled. But she had. That's a serious accusation, he said. It wasn't an accusation, she said. It was an observation. He looked at her for a long moment. The quality of his attention shifted, away from procedural toward the particular focus of a man recalculating what kind of problem he was standing in front of. She had seen that shift before, in other rooms on other men. It was the shift that happened when someone you had categorized as manageable turned out to be looking directly at you. You have until morning, he said. We'll be outside. He left. The door closed. Cale turned to her. If you give him the documents, I'm not giving him the documents. Then you can't go back. I know. She looked at the closed door and thought about what morning meant and what it didn't. I was never going to go back. Serena. He said her name without the title, and the absence of the title had a specific gravity. If you run again, he will follow with more than 4 riders. Damon will come himself. You will not have the same window. The coastal territories have limited... I'm not running, she said. He stopped. She looked at the back room where Elias was sitting quietly in the dark with his horse and his 3 years of accumulated trust that she would come when she said she would come. She thought about Marta Hale, who had been asking questions for 2 years and waiting for something she could hold. She thought about the 3 elders Cale had mentioned. She thought about the letter in Damon's own handwriting sitting in the place she had moved it to, and the difference between documents as leverage and documents as testimony, and what happened when you stopped trying to escape a system and decided instead to use it. The version of herself that had left Moonridge in the dark with a child on her back and a plan built on distance was not the version this moment required. She had spent 6 years being managed, being contained, being the load-bearing wall that held a structure together while the man who owned the structure pretended it stood on its own. She was done with distance. I need a messenger, she said. Someone who can reach Marta Hale before morning. Cale looked at her with an expression she did not try to read. What are you going to do? He said. She thought about the word redundant spoken in a study at midnight by a man who had believed she was not in the corridor. She thought about a woman who had died in a birth room. She thought about a child in the dark who had learned to be quiet because quietness was what the situation required, and who deserved, at some point before he was old enough to understand what he had survived, to learn that the world contained something else. Something he won't see coming, she said, because he never looked at me long enough to know what I was capable of. Outside, Renner's horses moved in the dark. Inside, Serena Vale stood in a small, salt-bleached house at the edge of everything she had been, and made the decision that divided her life in two. Not the leaving, which had been an ending, but this, which was something altogether different. This was the beginning of what she was going to do about all of it, and she was not going to be quiet about it anymore. The messenger left before midnight. Cale had a man, not the contact who had sold them out, a different one, someone who moved through the coastal road network with the practiced invisibility of a person who had built a life on being unremarkable. And Serena wrote 2 sentences on a strip of cloth because paper was too fragile in coast weather, and handed it to Cale without letting herself second-guess the handwriting. 2 sentences. Marta Hale's name at the top. The documents exist. Come with authority or don't come at all. That was it. Either Marta moved or she didn't. Either the elders had been waiting for something they could hold, the way Kyle had said, or they had been waiting in the way that people sometimes wait, with no real intention of acting, using patience as a substitute for courage. Serena had placed her remaining options on that distinction, and she did not have the luxury of examining it further. She went to check on Elias. He was asleep on the narrow cot in the back room, the horse tucked under his chin, his breathing the long, slow rhythm of a child who had decided, at some cellular level, that the situation was survivable. She stood in the doorway and looked at him and felt the particular quality of resolve that had nothing clean or triumphant in it. Just the cold, functional weight of a person who has located the thing they will not allow to be taken and has organized their entire remaining capacity around protecting it. She did not sleep. Renner came at first light. He came alone to the door this time, which told her he had made his own calculation overnight, that 4 riders outside a small house were a provocation that complicated the optics of what he needed this to look like, which was a family matter handled internally. Aluna voluntarily returning with the Alpha's heir. Not a seizure, not a scene. She opened the door before he knocked. He looked at her face and she watched him read it, and she watched the specific moment when he understood that the woman who had spent 6 years in managed containment in Moonridge Packhouse was not the woman currently standing in this doorway. "The Alpha is 2 hours behind me," he said. She had expected Damon to come himself. She had built the next 12 hours around it. "Good," she said. Renner's eyes sharpened. "You want him here." "I want this done in front of witnesses," she said. "Not in a back room, not managed. Done." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him recalculating, but running the variables of a situation that had shifted from retrieval operation to something he didn't have a clean category for. "The documents," he said, "are somewhere you won't find them before he arrives," she said, "and copies are somewhere else entirely." This was not precisely true. The copies were in process. Cale had been up most of the night, and the second set of documents was not yet where she needed it to be. But the statement had the texture of truth because the intention behind it was real, and she had learned from 6 years of watching Damon and Renner operate that the appearance of a completed strategic move and the completed strategic move itself were functionally identical in the crucial period before anyone could verify the difference. Renner looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what you're doing," he said. Not a threat. An honest question from a man who was genuinely trying to assess whether she did. "I understand it better than you do," she said, "because I'm not operating on the assumption that the only outcomes are the ones he's already decided on." She stepped back from the door. "Come in or don't," she said, "but stop standing in my doorway." But Damon arrived at mid-morning. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps this time, but the quality of attention that shifted in the settlement around the blue doorhouse when he rode in. 6 years of living beside an Alpha had calibrated her to the specific atmospheric change that accompanied his presence in any space. The way sound organized itself differently, the way people moved with the peripheral awareness of something that might require a response. She was standing in the main room when he came through the door. He looked worse than she had expected and better than she had hoped. The worst part was physical. He had clearly ridden through the night, coat still carrying the cold, jaw unshaved, the particular drawn quality of a face that had not slept. The better part, the part that complicated everything, was his eyes, which were looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him in years. Not anger, not the controlled administrative fury she had become accustomed to, the kind that processed everything as a resource management problem. Something rawer than that, something that had not yet been organized into a position. She did not let herself respond to it. "Where is he?" Damon said. "Safe." Serena. Her name in his mouth, without the Luna prefix, without the title as distance, just the word. "Where is my son?" "He's safe," she said again. "He's been safe. He's been safe because I made him safe, which is the same answer it's been for 3 years. That part hasn't changed." He looked around the room. His eyes moved to Cale, who was standing by the far wall with the careful stillness of a man who knew he was in a room that had already decided its outcome and was waiting to find out what that outcome was. "Voss," Damon said. "Blackthorn." Cale's voice was level. The air in the room had the specific density of a space containing 2 men who each believed they were the most dangerous thing in it. Serena had stood in rooms like this before, had spent 6 years managing rooms like this, and she felt the familiar pull of the role she had always played in them, the one that smoothed and redirected and kept the temperature manageable. She did not play it. "There are documents," she said. "Correspondence between Renner, 2 members of your inner circle, and Lara Voss going back 4 years. And a letter in your handwriting, Damon, that discusses problem resolution in language specific enough that read alongside the others, it constitutes a record of what was decided and who decided it." The room went very still. Damon's eyes came back to her. Something moved through them. Something she watched pass through its stages the way you watch weather move across open ground. Shock first, then the specific calculation of a man determining what he can afford to admit, then underneath both of those, something that was neither and was harder to name. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I've read everything 3 times, she said. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." "Those documents were kept by a woman who understood that the only thing that kept her alive was the value of what she knew," Serena said. "And when she stopped being careful enough about who else knew, she stopped being alive, which is what Renner's letter in the set also addresses, in its way." She watched Renner in her peripheral vision go very still against the wall. Damon looked at Renner. The look that passed between them lasted less than 3 seconds and contained, in those 3 seconds, the entire architecture of what Renner had done and what Damon had known, and what the space between those 2 things had cost everyone in its radius. Damon turned back to her. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was managing something at the outer limit of his management capacity. "This is not something you can use publicly without destroying the pack." "The pack's structure is already compromised," she said. "The only question is whether it gets rebuilt honestly or papered over again." "You would do that. You would burn it down." "I'm not the one who built a house on what you built it on," she said. "I'm not burning anything, I'm just refusing to keep the walls up." He crossed the room in 4 steps. She did not step back. She had decided sometime in the dark hours of this morning that stepping back was the last thing she was going to do in any room for the rest of her life, and the decision had settled into her body as a physical fact. Weight distributed, spine straight, eyes level. She was not performing this. It was just where she was now. He stopped close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face and the dust from the road, and the specific way his chest moved with the breathing of a man who had ridden through the night toward something he could not categorize as either a person he needed to retrieve or a problem he needed to solve, because it was both and neither, and something else he had not made room for. "What do you want?" he said. Low. Not the alpha register. The other one, the one she had heard rarely and had spent years understanding, was the register under the register, the one that didn't have strategy in it. She looked at him. She thought about what she had wanted. 6 years ago, standing at a binding ceremony, she had wanted the simple, unremarkable thing, a partnership, a real one. The kind where two people were actually present to each other and the weight of what they built was shared rather than distributed unequally in the particular way that always seemed, somehow, to result in the woman holding the structural load. She had wanted to be seen. What she wanted now was different in form and identical in origin. "I want Elias protected from what comes next," she said. "Whatever is decided about you, about the pack, about all of it, I want him outside it. I want the council's decision to leave him intact." He blinked. Whatever he had expected, it was not this, not her first position being about the child rather than herself. "And what else?" he said. "I want to testify before the council myself, not through a representative, my words, in that room. You want to stand in front of the elders and tell them what I know and what I observed and what I can document," she said. "Yes. Not to destroy you, to make sure what happened to Lara Voss is on record, because she was a woman who made bad choices in a system that made bad choices available, and she died for it, and that deserves to be said out loud by someone." His face was doing something she had not seen it do in years, maybe ever. The specific work of a man processing the fact that the person he had been managing and containing and positioning and stripping of title in midnight conversations had turned out to be operating from a foundation he had not identified and could not simply overpower. The thing about people who have spent years being underestimated was that they developed, over those years, a particular kind of strength, not the loud kind, not the kind that announced itself, but the structural kind. The kind built from carrying weight that was never acknowledged as weight, from making decisions in rooms where your decisions were credited to someone else, from surviving a sustained campaign of reduction with your internal architecture not just intact but reinforced. He had never understood what she was made of because he had never needed to. He had the luxury of not knowing because she had kept the house standing. That luxury was finished. "Renner," Damon said without turning. "Alpha. Leave us." A pause, then footsteps. The door. Cale looked at Serena. She gave him a slight nod. He followed Renner out, which left her and Damon alone in the small, salt-bleached room with the sea audible through the walls and the documents somewhere he couldn't reach, and the 3 years of everything between them present in the air like weather. He sat down. It was such a simple thing. Just a man sitting down in a chair in a room, but the weight of it was specific, and she recognized it for what it was. Not defeat, not strategy. The act of a man who had been standing at maximum tension for 24 hours and had arrived somewhere that his body had decided was, despite everything, a place where he could sit. She sat across from him. "I didn't know," he said. "About Renner. Not the details." She looked at him. "I knew there was a management decision," he said. The words came out with the texture of something that had been kept in a closed space too long. "I knew he had handled a problem. I chose not to know the specifics." That's not the same as not knowing," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." The fire had burned down. The room was cold in the way of coastal rooms in autumn. Not the sharp cold of mountain air, but the pervasive damp cold that settled into everything and required a specific kind of tending to manage. "She was going to expose the correspondence herself," he said. "That's what Renner told me, that she had decided the position she'd been promised wasn't coming, and she was going to take the pack down with her." He looked at his hands. "I believed him. I don't know anymore whether I believed him because it was true or because it was easier to believe than the alternative." Serena looked at the man across from her. The jaw she used to know, the hands she used to hold, the face she had spent years reading and had understood, she realized now, less completely than she had thought. Not because he was illegible, but because she had, in the way of people who need something to be true, read him through the filter of what she needed him to be. They had both done that, in different directions, with different costs. "It doesn't matter now why you believed it," she said. "It matters what you do with what you know." He looked up. "The elders are coming," she said. "Marta Hale will be here before evening if she moves at the pace I think she'll move. The documents will be in her hands tonight. What happens after that depends on what you decide to do between now and then." "You're giving me a window," he said. "I'm telling you what's coming," she said. "What you do with the information is your decision. It's always been your decision. That's the thing about being the alpha. You never had to stop making them. He looked at her with the expression she had been watching form for the past half hour. The one that was not strategy and was not management, and was the thing underneath both of those that he had spent years burying under the architecture of his own authority. "I was going to take your title," he said. "I know." "The word I used—" He stopped. "Redundant," she said. His jaw tightened. "You weren't supposed to hear that." "No," she said. "I wasn't." Outside, the sea moved against the rocks with the indifferent, continuous patience of something that had been doing this for longer than anyone's grief or fury or regret, and would continue doing it long after. Serena had grown up with that sound and had spent 6 years without it, and was only now, sitting in this small room with this man and this unresolved weight between them, understanding what she had been missing. Not the sound itself. The reminder the sound carried, that the things which shaped you were still there, still doing their work, independent of whether you had access to them. She heard horses on the road outside, multiple horses, moving fast. Damon's head came up. His body shifted. The specific shift of an alpha whose threat processing was instantaneous and physical before it was cognitive. She had seen it 1,000 times and understood it in her body even now as a signal. An ingrained response to his response. He crossed to the window. She stood up. "How many?" she said. His face, in profile, had gone to the controlled blankness he wore when he was calculating rapidly and did not want his calculation visible. 7, 8. A pause. Not Marta. She came to stand beside him. Through the salt-hazed glass, she could see the road. The riders coming in from the northern approach, not the eastern track Marta would have taken from Moonridge. The colors were wrong. Not Moonridge. Not Stonehaven. Her stomach moved with the particular cold drop of a plan, encountering a variable it hadn't accounted for. "Who are they?" she said. Damon's jaw was set hard. His hands on the window frame were white at the knuckles. She looked at his face and saw something she had not expected to see. Not calculation, not management, not the alpha processing a tactical problem. Something more primitive than that. Something that lived below the title. "The Northern Alliance," he said. "Renner's contacts." He said it with the specific flatness of a man who has just understood something about a person he trusted and is still absorbing the shape of the betrayal. "He didn't come here to bring you back." He turned and looked at her. "He came here to make sure neither of us left with those documents intact." The horses stopped outside. The door opened. Renner stood in the frame. Behind him, she could hear the settlement going quiet, in the way settlements went quiet when armed men arrived and the people who lived there made the fast collective calculation that this was not their fight. Renner looked at Damon. His face was the flat professional mask she had seen in 100 packhouse corridors, and underneath it, visible now in a way it had never been visible before because he was no longer performing deference, was something colder and more specific. "The documents," Renner said. "Both sets. Now." Damon looked at the man who had served him for a decade. Looked at him with the expression of a man arriving finally at the full-length mirror he had been avoiding. "You told them we were here," Damon said. "I told them the documents were here," Renner said, "which is a problem for more people than just you." Serena looked at Renner. She looked at the men behind him visible through the open door. She looked at Damon beside her, who was standing with the specific stillness of a man who was one decision away from a version of himself he could not come back from. And she understood, with the clarity that came from being in rooms with him for 6 years and watching the way he processed the moments that cost him the most, that he was standing at the exact edge of the thing she had not been willing to count on. The documents were in the wall cavity behind the kitchen hearth. Renner didn't know that. He thought they were in the chest in the main room, which contained nothing but Elias's extra clothes and the wooden horse's twin that she had been making slowly for the past 2 weeks. She had 30 seconds, maybe less, before he stopped asking and started looking. She looked at Damon, he looked at her, and in that look, compressed, stripped of everything they had performed at each other for years, just the two of them in a coastal room with the sea outside and a man with a decade of decisions in his hands standing in the doorway. She saw him make the choice. She saw it happen in his body before his mouth opened. She saw it and felt the breath come back into her lungs, and thought, with the hard, cold clarity of a woman who had stopped counting on anyone's courage but her own, and was only now adjusting that accounting. Too late, too late, too late. But not too late for this. Not quite. "Cale," she said, her voice carrying through the wall toward the kitchen, where she had sent him an hour ago for a reason she was only now revealing to herself. Now. The kitchen wall came apart in Cale's hands faster than it should have, which meant he had found the cavity before she called him, had been standing there in the dark of the kitchen with the documents in his grip and his ear to the wall, waiting. This was the thing about people who had learned to survive in systems built on concealment. They stopped waiting to be told what was happening and started reading the room themselves. He came through the kitchen doorway with the documents wrapped in the oilcloth she had packed them in, and in his other hand a knife that was not decorative, and behind him through the back window she could see two of the Northern Riders who had circled the house and were now discovering that the back entry was not undefended. Renner moved. Damon moved faster. 6 years of watching him in rooms had not prepared her for the specific speed of him when the calculation was finished and the body took over. The pure physical fact of an alpha in motion, which was different from a man in motion the way a breaking wave was different from standing water. He crossed the room and put himself between Renner and Serena with the particular economy of someone for whom this was not a decision but a reflex, a thing the body did before the mind had finished the sentence. Renner stopped. He looked at Damon with the expression of a man recalibrating a prediction that had just failed. "Move," Renner said. "No," Damon said. One word, flat and absolute, with the specific register of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the thing other things stopped at, and was using that fact for the first time in the service of something that wasn't himself. Renner's eyes moved to the documents in Cale's hands. They moved to the men behind him. They moved back to Damon's face, reading it the way a man reads a terrain he thought he knew, and is discovering contains a feature he missed. "You're protecting her," Renner said. Not accusatory, almost curious, the way a man is curious about a variable that has invalidated his model. "I'm ending this," Damon said. Patson. What followed was not clean. Nothing that happened in that room in the next 4 minutes was clean or cinematic, or resolved with the precision of a plan executing correctly. Two of Renner's borrowed riders forced the back door, and Cale held them in the kitchen doorway with a combination of the knife and a cast-iron pot that left one man with a broken collarbone and the other with a very clear understanding of why you assessed your opponent before you committed to a hallway. Damon and Renner went through the main room's furniture and ended up against the far wall with Renner's forearm across Damon's throat and Damon's hand on Renner's wrist, and 3 years of something that had been building in the architecture of their alliance finally coming apart under its own accumulated stress. Serena picked up the fire iron from the hearth. She crossed the room and she hit Renner across the back of the knee with it. Not a killing blow, not even close, just the specific point of mechanical failure in a human leg when struck correctly. And Renner buckled and Damon came free, and Renner went down on one knee on the stone floor, breathing hard with his hands out, and the expression of a man who had just lost a calculation he had been running for a decade. She stood over him with the fire iron and her chest moving fast and sweat at her hairline and the document still in Cale's hands across the room. Renner looked up at her. "You should have left," he said. His voice was ragged. "When he first gave you the chance. You should have taken the settlement and gone." "There was no settlement," she said. "There was management. There's a difference." She looked at Damon. He was against the wall with his hand at his throat where Renner's forearm had been, watching her with an expression she did not have a category for. "Tie him," she said. Damon pushed off the wall and did it without a word. Tichsabn. Marta Hale arrived at mid-afternoon. She came with 2 other elders and 4 pack members who had the look of people selected for both their discretion and their capability, which told Serena that Marta had understood the message in 2 sentences and had made her own assessment of what it required. The elder woman walked through the blue door and looked at the room. Renner tied to the chair, 2 Northern Riders sitting against the kitchen wall with Kyle standing over them. Damon by the window, Serena in the middle of it with the fire iron still in her hand because she had not yet found a reason to put it down. And her face did the thing it did, the reading thing, taking in the data with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for 40 years. "Well," Marta said. "The documents are in the oilcloth," Serena said. "Correspondence, 4 years of it. A letter in the Alpha's handwriting, and Renner's direct communication regarding the circumstances of Lara Voss's death." Marta looked at Renner, looked at Damon, looked back at Serena. "Are you injured?" she said. "No." "The child?" "In the back room, unharmed." Marta nodded once. She took the documents from Cale with both hands and the careful deliberateness of a woman who understood she was holding something that was about to change the shape of several lives. And she stood there for a moment looking at the top page. Then she looked up at Damon. "Alpha Blackthorn," she said, "I am formally informing you that the Elder Council of Moonridge has convened an emergency session pending review of evidence submitted by Luna Vale. You are requested to present yourself before the council within 3 days." Damon looked at her, then at Serena, then back out the window at the sea. "Understood," he said. The council session happened in Moonridge. Serena returned for it. She had not planned to return, had planned to send testimony through Marta, had planned to manage her presence in that space through the safer medium of written record. But when the morning came, she found herself getting Elias dressed in his better shirt and taking his hand and walking back into the packed territory she had left in the dark 6 weeks ago with the specific, deliberate stride of a woman who is choosing every step. The great hall had been cleared, and the elders sat at the long table, and the pack members who had been invited to witness stood along the walls. Serena had sat in that room 100 times. She had stood at the front of it. She had spoken in it, moved through it, been visible in it in all the ways that the Luna's visibility served the Alpha's authority. She stood at the front now on her own terms, and she spoke for 40 minutes. She did not perform. She did not moderate her language for palatability or shape her account toward any particular outcome. She simply told the truth, the sequence of it, the texture of it, the specific weight of what 6 years in that house had cost, and what she had observed and what the documents corroborated. She talked about Lara Voss without hatred and without exoneration, because Lara Voss had been a person who had made choices in a system that rewarded certain kinds of ruthlessness and had died for the miscalculation of trusting the wrong ruthless person, and that deserved to be said plainly. She talked about Elias and what it meant to raise a child in a house built on concealment, and what she wanted the record to reflect about who he was independent of the politics of his origins. When she finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms went quiet when something true had been said in them. Marta asked 3 questions. The other elders asked 2 each. Serena answered all of them. Then she sat down and held Elias's hand under the table where he was sitting beside her with the wooden horse and the particular focused stillness of a child who understood that something important was happening and had decided the most useful thing he could be was present and quiet. He leaned against her arm. She let him. Damon testified last. She had not expected what he said, and she thought afterward that this was the final proof of how completely she had stopped seeing him clearly somewhere in the middle years, that she had catalogued him so thoroughly as a man incapable of self-examination that she had stopped leaving room for the possibility that the examination was happening, just in private, just in the place where people did the work they couldn't afford to do publicly. He stood at the front of the room, and he did not qualify, and he did not manage. He said that Renner had acted with his implicit permission even when the explicit order had never been given, and that the distinction between those 2 things was the kind he had spent his career making when it suited him, and that he was not going to make it now. He said that Lara Voss had been a person in his care, and he had failed that responsibility. He said that he had run Moonridge Pack for 8 years on the assumption that strength meant never being wrong in public, and that this assumption had cost the pack more than he had the ability to calculate standing in front of them. He looked at Serena once during this. Just once. Just long enough. She looked back at him and felt the specific complexity of a moment that was not forgiveness and was not its opposite. Something more honest than either, the acknowledgement that a person could be more than their worst decisions and that this did not erase the decisions. that both things were true simultaneously, and that pretending otherwise in either direction was its own kind of dishonesty. The council deliberated for 2 days. On the morning of the third day, Marta came to the room in the pack house where Serena was staying with Elias, and she sat down and she said what the council had decided. Renner would face formal charges before the Interpack Tribunal. The Northern Alliance members who had come to the coast would be identified and dealt with through the appropriate channels. The evidence of Lara Voss's death would be entered into the permanent record. Damon would be removed as Alpha of Moonridge. Marta paused after she said this and looked at Serena with the expression she always wore when she was about to say the thing the official version left out. The council also discussed the Luna title, she said. There is a position, if you want it, not beside an Alpha. The council is proposing a restructured governance. 3 elders, 1 acting administrator with executive function. They want you for the administrator role. Serena looked at the window. Outside, Elias was in the courtyard with one of the pack children he had met 2 days ago, and they were engaged in some elaborate negotiation involving sticks and the rules of a game that appeared to have been invented on the spot. No, she said. Marta waited. I'm not the person to rebuild Moonridge, Serena said. I'm the person who survived what Moonridge became. Those are different qualifications. She paused. Marta, you should do it. The elder woman looked at her for a long moment. I'm 71 years old, Marta said. You've been running this pack informally for 20 years, Serena said. The only difference is now they'd have to call it what it is. Something shifted in Marta's face. Not quite a smile. The thing under a smile. Where will you go? Marta said. Back to the coast, Serena said. I promised him the sea. Damon found her the evening before she left. She was in the courtyard where Elias had been playing, sitting on the low stone wall with the last of the light going orange over the tree line. She heard his footsteps and recognized them and did not turn. He sat down on the wall a few feet away. Not close. The distance of a man who had calculated where he had the right to be. They sat in silence for a while. The pack house behind them was lit up and audible, the sounds of an institution in transition, which had a specific quality, busy and anxious in equal measure. He called you Rana, Damon said finally. He always has. I didn't know that. A pause. I didn't know a lot of things about him. She looked at the tree line. You still can. He was quiet. Not now, he said. He doesn't. I'm not who he needs right now. Maybe not for a long time. Another pause, the kind that had actual thought in it. But I'd like to be someone he knows, eventually, if that's something he decides he wants. She turned and looked at him. The light was doing the thing it did at this hour, reducing faces to their essential structure, stripping the performative layer, leaving just the bones and the eyes and whatever was actually in them. He looked like a man who had walked into a room in himself he had been locking for years and found it smaller and more manageable than he had feared, and was now standing in it not knowing what came next but no longer needing to not know. She had loved this man. She wanted to be honest about that. Not the love she had defended past its natural end, the love she had performed to keep herself oriented in a marriage that had stopped being a partnership years before she was willing to say so. The real thing, which had existed, which had been genuine on her end and had been, she believed now, genuine on his in the way that men like him were capable of genuine things. Incompletely, without the full apparatus of attention and presence it required, but real. That love was gone. She had grieved it on a ridge in the dark, and on a coastal road in the cold, and in a small house by the sea while her son slept, and she sat with what remained after you stripped away the thing you had been building your identity around. What remained was herself, smaller in some ways, larger in others, unmistakably her own. Tell him yourself, she said. When the time is right. He's not a fragile thing. He'll hear you. Damon nodded. She stood up. For what it's worth, she said, and she meant it exactly as much as she said it, no more and no less. I hope you figure out who you are when you're not the alpha. I think it might be someone worth knowing. She walked back into the house. She did not look back. Not because looking back was wrong, but because there was nothing left in that direction that she needed. The account was settled, not clean. Nothing that had involved real people and real years and real cost was ever clean, but settled. The kind of settled that came not from resolution, but from acceptance of what could not be resolved and the decision to carry it without letting it determine the direction. They left the next morning. Elias walked on his own legs the whole way to the gate, which he announced he was going to do with the seriousness of a declaration of policy, and she led him, slowing her pace to his and watching him navigate the packhouse grounds with the focused attention of a child making a memory. He had decided mattered. At the gate he stopped and looked back. She stopped beside him. The packhouse stood in the early light, old stone and old timber, the particular solidity of a place that had been standing for a long time and would continue standing after everyone currently in it had been replaced by someone else. It was just a building. It had never been what she thought it was. Elias looked at it for a moment. "Okay," he said, to himself or to her or to the building. She did not ask which. He took her hand. They walked. The sea was the same. She had been afraid, coming back to it, that it would be smaller than she remembered, that the months of carrying it as a destination had inflated it past what the reality could support. This was the thing about hope. It was a story you told yourself to keep moving, and sometimes the story outgrew its ending. It was not smaller. It was exactly as large as it was supposed to be, which was larger than anything Elias had ever seen. And she watched his face when they came over the last rise, and the full width of it opened up before them. Gray-green and massive and endlessly in motion, the sound of it filling the air in a way that made everything else quieter. He stopped walking. He stood very still, the wooden horse held at his side, and looked at the sea with the expression of a person encountering something that exceeds their existing capacity for scale and is quietly, without drama, expanding to accommodate it. She stood beside him. "It's bigger," he said. "Than what?" "Than I thought." He paused. "Than everything." She crouched down beside him so she was at his level, and they looked at it together, the same water from the same angle. And she thought about all the things this child had absorbed before he was old enough to have chosen to absorb them. The weight of a house built on secrets, the specific texture of being loved imperfectly by people who were imperfect in different ways, the experience of a world that had arranged itself around his existence without ever quite centering it. He was 4 years old. He had the sea glass eyes and the dark hair and the serious quality of a person who had been paying attention longer than anyone had thought to notice. He was going to be fine, not because she had protected him from everything. She hadn't, nobody could, but because she had made sure, in the years when it counted most, that he knew what it felt like to be the person someone stayed for. That was the thing you could give a child that no amount of material provision or institutional security replaced. The knowledge, laid down in the bone before the mind had words for it, that they were worth the staying. Everything else he would have to build himself. But that foundation, that one thing, was solid. She put her arm around his shoulders. He leaned in. The sea moved and moved and moved. The house she found was not the Blue Door house. It was farther down the coast, a half-day's walk from the settlement, set on a low bluff above a stretch of black rock and gray sand. It had belonged to a fishing family whose children had grown and gone, and who had no interest in the maintenance of a place they no longer needed. It needed work. The roof required attention in 2 places, and the window frames had swelled in the salt air, and the back garden was 3 years past the point of calling itself a garden. She bought it with the money she had been moving quietly for 11 days back in Moonridge, and some additional amount that Cale Voss, in the manner of a man who had decided a specific debt existed and was going to service it without being asked, had deposited with the coastal settlement's account keeper before she arrived. She did not argue with the deposit. She would have a year ago. She had learned, somewhere on the road between who she had been and who she was becoming, that accepting help from someone who offered it without condition was not the same as being indebted to them. It was just allowing the world to be more generous than you had been taught to expect. She fixed the roof first, then the windows. Then she turned to the garden. Elias helped with the garden in the way that 4-year-olds helped with things, with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and a complete creative reinterpretation of any instruction more complex than one step. And she worked alongside him in the dirt with the physical satisfaction of a person doing something real with their hands, and found, in those hours, a quality of peace that was not the absence of difficulty, but something that existed alongside it. Peace was not the end of feeling. She had learned that the hard way. It was not the state you reached after you had finished grieving, or finished being angry, or finished caring about the things that had happened to you. It was something you built in the middle of all those things, slowly, out of the materials of a daily life that was genuinely yours. A garden, a child's voice. The sea through every window, the work of it, the plain, irreducible work of building a life from the ground up, which was hard and sometimes lonely, and sometimes inexplicably full of the kind of quiet joy that did not announce itself but simply arrived, the way good weather arrived, present before you had noticed the change. The letter from Moonridge came in spring. It was from Marta, in the elder's precise handwriting, and it reported that the restructured council was functioning, that Renner's tribunal had concluded with a verdict that the record now reflected accurately, and that the pack was, in Marta's measured assessment, healing in the manner of things that had been genuinely sick rather than merely performing sickness. Slowly, with setbacks, without any of the dramatic overnight transformation that made for a better story, but was not how actual institutions repaired themselves. She mentioned Damon once, briefly, in the practical manner of a woman including information she had assessed as relevant without editorializing about it. He had left Moonridge territory voluntarily 2 weeks after the council decision. His current location was not her department. He had left a letter for Elias, which Marta enclosed, sealed, for Serena to decide the appropriate time for. She held the sealed letter for a while. Then she put it in the box she kept on the high shelf, the one with the small collection of things she was holding until their time. And she went back out to where Elias was attempting to teach himself to fish from the black rocks below the bluff, with the wooden horse propped against a rock beside him as an audience. And she sat down on the rock above him and watched him work and let herself simply be there, in the good ordinary weight of the present, which was the only place any of it had ever been real. He looked up at her. "Nothing yet," he said. "You've got time," she said. He turned back to the water with the focused patience of a child who had learned, without anyone teaching him the lesson directly, that the things worth having required the willingness to sit with the not yet. The sea moved. The light came down. Somewhere behind her the garden was growing into what it was going to be, and beside her the child who had been handed to her in the dark of a winter morning was becoming, one ordinary day at a time, exactly who he was supposed to become. She did not need it to mean more than it meant. It meant enough. It was, in the end, what she had always been looking for. Not the crown, not the title, not the restored marriage or the public vindication or the particular satisfaction of having been proven right in front of everyone who had watched her and found her insufficient. Just this. The life that was actually hers, which she had built from what remained after everything else, was stripped away, on a bluff above the sea, in the good plain light of a day that asked nothing from her except to be present in it. She pressed her feet against the rock. She breathed. The greatest revenge, she had learned, was not something you took. It was something you built, slowly, out of the rubble of what had tried to reduce you, until one morning you looked up and realized the structure you were standing in was not revenge at all. It was just your life, and it was enough.